Yeah. Okay. That must go to someone in Ings. Yeah. Hopefully that will help. Yeah. So let's get started anyway. And get us back on this specific page. Yeah, the topic in context, this is called body territory transversal feminisms in Latin America. And here in the topic in context, you can see artifact from a workshop amongst women. And it says, we as defenders, that is land defenders, whenever alone, for the defense of our bodies and our territories. So the Argentine feminist thinker and activist Veronica Gago talks about the transversalities in women's struggles in Latin America in this way. Diverse struggles have started to use the concept of the body territory to talk about the communities that resist neo-extractivist attacks, a resistance largely led by women. This is the case of Berta Cáceres, who I'll talk about shortly, whose death was termed a territorial femicide. This point connects a notion of the body that not only goes beyond the human, but also refers to the question of the nature from a non-liberal point of view. There's not an abstract conservationism, but rather it confronts the dispossession of material possibilities of life that today shape the antagonism between multinational companies and states amongst populations that are being looted and displaced. This extractivist paradigm, however, should also be extended to urban and suburban spaces, where we find, again, finance acting in multiple aspects of extractive operations, from formal and informal real estate speculation to massive indebtedness, particularly as faced by women. Following that line, it is necessary to conceptualize extractivism in an expanded way, the operation through which capital captures value today. And for her, transversality is the ability to build coalitions in ways that bring people together, that produce proximity, but between very different struggles, between, for example, migrant struggles, that of the workers, those in the unions, in universities, in high schools, in poor districts, and in Argentina, they use the word villero to refer to such districts. They tell you, here it is not that feminism has to come. We do villero feminism. Feminism ceased to be an exteriority that somehow relates to an other, right? Which is an important point. So in this last week of the unit, we'll follow such struggles, think from them, and try to weave between them, because this is indeed how feminist theory is proceeding in the continent as well, whether we call that decolonial, communitarian, popular feminisms, and indigenous feminisms. So on the following page, which was kind of a heads up for preparing for this week, there are a couple of readings. There's also a video in case people didn't have time to read, and that is a presentation called Feminized Resistances and Politics in and of the Feminism, of the Feminine, Associate Professor Sara Simota. That's from her work. And in fact, one of the readings very much speaks to the concerns that she addresses in the video. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read that or follow the video. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, it was just an optional thing. But there's a whole lot of other resources here, and I didn't want to bombard people, but yeah, I mean, in trying to bring together the voices of not just academic women, but also those involved in social struggles around extractivism, around land defense, in different parts of Abya Yala, I wanted to make sure that there was a bit of a clearing ground around their thinking. Yeah. And so some of them are academics, but they have very strong ties to community. Betty Lozano is a really good example. So her work springs out of the Colombian Pacific and the violence, especially faced by women in the context of the oil industry, and also the presence of paramilitary and contention over territories, very much at that intersection. And she understands the violence faced by women as really caught up in those dynamics, yeah? That it's not just about some abstract notion of being killed because you're a woman, it's actually because of the military masculinities, which are also kind of imitated by men when they, especially men of color, where they feel disempowered in the communities. And so really it's reading violence across different kinds of scales, which yes, are gendered, but have to do with the very structures at place in those territories and the power contentions, both from the state level, but also parallel powers such as presence of the paramilitary or even drug traffickers in communities, which impinge on the lives of everyone, right? But women experience those forces in particular ways, yeah? So her work has a really good optic on that, that takes us away from, say, some more standard feminist accounts, particularly of the global north, which understand gendered violence as being about, you know, problematic interpersonal relationships only. She actually brings in the whole conflict over use of land, expropriation of land and resources, as well as the racialization that the state is involved in of communities that are seen to be marginal, yeah, in Colombia. So it's really important that we take into account the voices of people like Betty Lozano and others, because really speaking, they're the go-tos, not the voices that are only in English, right? Or of feminists that follow a kind of transnational feminist paradigm and only use women of color, for example, as props for their arguments. No, we need to actually center the voices of such women, whether they be Indigenous, Afro-descendant, or Mestiza women. And so there's a whole lot of resources that, in particular, if this is a focus for people's final essays, can be drawn upon in this lecture preparation. And there are some thinking questions as well in relation to the two main readings. So I just wanted to put that there because obviously we need to speak multiply, right? And I'm also not Latin American and not Indigenous and not Afro-descendant, right? I see a lot of value in the work that these women are doing. But if I were to create a sort of reductionism or solipsism of thinking that my particular stance should predominate over those, the multiple analyses of such women involved in struggles, then I would be doing a form of epistemic violence, right? So it's very important for us to think about from whence such thinking emerges and to be able to place knowledge and in-place knowledge. There's a whole lot there that I just really recognize that cannot be just encountered within 1 week, but that we need to include the plurality of voices in anything that we imagine as transversal feminisms. So to get to the substance of the actual lecture, transversal feminisms connecting bodies and territories. You might recall this image I actually used, I think, in week 9 as an orienting device to think about the 500 years of conquest and colonialism in Abya Yala. And this is probably like from downtown Cajamarca, where a lot of mining operations have been proposed, and also, as a space, as a city, it actually has been the place for a lot of contention, for marches and protests, including of Andean women, such as we saw in the documentary Daughter of the Lake, Hija de la Laguna. And the graffiti says, ni la tierra ni las mujeres somos territorio de conquista. Neither the earth nor women are territory of conquest. So it's a real resistance to that logic of colonialism, which is simultaneously racialized and gendered. I wanted us to place ourselves and in-place ourselves, thinking about the legacies of the women in our lives as well, and the knowledges that we have drawn from them. Not necessarily as mothers, although mother goes beyond the biological. It also includes any of those sorts of influences of elder women, for example, who've gone before us. And, typically I would cite my own mother because, she led the household on her own, She had altogether 6 kids. I'm one of them. And a really good way, a Zen way of dealing with life. But she, apart from being a yoga teacher in the 60s, when it wasn't that popular, and in the early 70s in women's centers, my mum also constantly reminded me of the importance of building resilience, of working from our values, of recognizing our obligations, yeah, and that as hard as things can get, that part of the message that she had to pass on to me reiteratively growing up was that it's all part of our learning, that we have to have that openness, that we have to be willing to, and I'll use the phrase, put our body on the line, which is definitely part of popular feminisms in Latin America. But I never really liked that phrase. Well, Earth is a school, because I felt like I was constantly having to go to school. And indeed, I'm still here, the eternal student. But I show that debt to my mom because it's important to be able to account for our foremothers and those that have shaped our thinking and our ways of being in the world. Yeah, celebrate our ancestors, the women who came before us, embody those values and those principles. This is a very important notion from Latin American indigenous feminism, that is to say, acuerparnos, to take on and embody solidarity in real ways, not in exclusive hierarchical ways, in ways that actually require us to do the labor, yeah, and recognize that labor, of course, as well, of diverse women, elder women, queer women, mixed, multiply raced individuals as well in the context of Abya Yala, that's mestiza women, indigenous women, to actually pit ourselves right at the center of that work that is required for transformation. Yeah. So there's a lot in Spanish there that pays homage to this idea of mother lines. And Sarah Simora does that in her work quite importantly. She actually has a new book coming out that's maybe called Mother Lines, actually. Yeah. Acuerparnos es poner en sintonía nuestros cuerpos, nuestro sentir, pensar, rompiendo las fronteras y distancias territoriales coloniales. To put our body in it is to put our bodies together in harmony through field thinking, which we referred to last lecture, or no, the previous one. Yeah, that was concerning political ontologies and overcoming territorial and colonial distances. So that's me as a kid. And my mum was wearing what apparently is a Chanel dress. I'm not sure, but someone told me that. She did know how to dress. Now, thinking about mothers, remembering our mothers, but also thinking about mothers not just as biological mothers, as I said before. Did you? Fantastic. Which level was that? 2? Okay. Yeah. Did you have Beatriz? Yeah. Yeah. So she was a Lenca woman, a defensora. She won the Emma Golden Environment Prize for her work. I think that was in 2015. We're going to hear from her children, right? So she was fighting against the construction of a mega dam on territory, and she was the head of the Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras, called PIN, yeah, co-founder and coordinator. She's actually the same age, well, she would be the same age as me. And so I felt like I wanted to kind of include her in invoking mothers, recognizing as well that her example continues to inspire in spite of the horrificness of her death. So let's listen to what her children have to say about her and her legacy.
Berta Cáceres, que era mi mami, su fuerza era también un llamado a hacerse cargo de las cosas a sí mismo y ella nos enseña a asumirnos guerreras y guerreros y a pelear esa vida.
De sentirse también parte de los hombres y mujeres que viven en situaciones de represión, que viven todas las diferentes formas de dominación. Se nos impone justamente eso de que no podemos soñar, que no tenemos la capacidad para transformar esta realidad, y ellas demuestran que se puede.
Yo creo que el legado que nos deja mi mami es el legado de sentir del sentido de la justicia, la rebeldía. Nos asumimos orgullosas y orgullosos, el pueblo del Empira, el pueblo lenca también del Empira y de verdad, que es nuestra mamá y nuestra líder. La muerte no nos va a parar. Que su dinero no vale más que nuestras vidas, que no somos daños colaterales, que la muerte y que nuestra madre, y que hoy nuestra madre no esté acá, no es un daño colateral. Es una vida que perdimos y es una vida que nos había dado y que nos sigue dando esperanza, que nos enseñó un camino y que nos enseñó otras formas de relacionarnos. A 6 meses del asesinato de Berta Cáceres, mi mami, exigimos justicia.
Los invitamos a sumar su voz para exigir justicia por el asesinato de mi mamá, ingresando a greenpeace.org.
So obviously there's a lot of emotions we can feel and think through as expressed by her children. When her daughter is talking, you can hear also the indignation. You can feel it, right? The passion, though, also to continue her mother's legacy. So just to kind of bring things together, Berta Cáceres was an Honduran Lenca indigenous environmental activist and co-founder and coordinator of the Council of Popular Indigenous Organizations of Honduras. As I said, she won the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2015 for a grassroots campaign that successfully pressured the world's largest dam builder to pull out of its project, the Agua Zarca Dam. Less than a week before International Women's Day, in 2016, Honduran military men trained by the Pentagon burst into her home and assassinated her. Feminist, environmentalist, and anti-imperialist, she was a charismatic organizer and staunch opponent of mega projects that stole land and poisoned the earth for indigenous people. She was everything, the epitome of what the henchmen of capitalism loathed and feared. Berta Cáceres pioneered a new generation of women leaders in Latin America. These new leaders lived the intersectionality between class, race, and gender, not as lines that crisscross, but in each breath they take. Berta's leadership was recognized worldwide for how she emphasized uniting struggles. She passed on to her children and members of the organization called PIN, the Lenca indigenous worldview and conviction that Mother Earth must be protected by an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist analysis that provides a framework to understand attacks on land and people by linking them to the national and global context. A firm belief in the power of international solidarity was something she propounded as well. She insisted on environmental activism as standing up to patriarchal forces that destroy the planet, and that the defense of territory is actually a defense of women's rights because patriarchy claims women's bodies as its territory. So these connections, weaving these connections, are really important in indigenous, communitarian, popular, and decolonial feminisms in Abya Yala. This is actually from a performance, which is kind of like a performance essay, yeah, produced by Julieta Paredes, who was part of Mujeres Creando. And you might recall, if you're at home and you listen to this as well, that one of the group's podcasts dealt with Mujeres Creando as well as their in-class presentation. And so this particular video essay and performance, which she calls a non-performance, we'll get to that, is entitled Hilando Fino desde el Feminismo Comunitario, Weaving Fine Feminism, Communitarian Feminism. Yeah? And what she does within the performance, there's probably a note there that I could draw on. Paredes stages a transformation during her presentation, changing from her westernized clothes to her grandmother's clothes, and so visibly turning into an indigenous woman or chola, Bolivian chola. Paredes claims that in Bolivia, nobody looks at me when I'm dressing as a chola. We become invisible as if they're not political subjects. Stating that cholas don't have a body, don't have a sexuality, don't have ideas. Paredes she proposes to engage in political participation with and from her body. She is also lesbian identified. She insists that she is not doing a performance, but an actual transmission of her sisters and her people's thoughts and demands through her voice and her body. In this manner, Paredes brings to presence the very topics that she is discussing in Hilando Fino desde el Feminismo Comunitario, being that women's corporeality has been at the center of colonial penetration. She proposes that resistance and contestation against colonialism, including in its contemporary guises, must come from those feminine bodies or feminized bodies. Thus, the task of recovering women's corporeality and sexuality is the basis of her proposal of communal feminism. So you can actually see the whole performance online, but you can see how she really takes inspiration from her grandmother in bringing her into present through the taking on of the Cholita garb. And then, so it's like across temporalities, isn't it? Yeah, and then dressing in her very common way of claiming her sexuality and her identification as well. So this idea of from our bodies, working from the bodies, which is simultaneously a canvas on which violence can be inscribed, whether it be as a territorial feminicide in the case of the life of Berta Cáceres, because let's not fool ourselves that this wasn't just an individualized kind of hit. It was to tell all members of the community that their leader and women generally can be targets of violence as a form of punishment, as an inscription of what Rita Segato refers to as the pedagogy of cruelty, of patriarchal coloniality. We see this insistence on bringing the body, putting the body, poner el cuerpo into it, in the work as well of the Chilean collective Las Tesis, putting the body into it. This particular video performance went viral, and it's called A Rapist in Your Path. Even women in Lebanon have taken up this performance. So we can see how these things diffuse from one part of the global south to another very quickly. And actually, they're putting their body into it, and they're putting feminist theory into practice, because chiefly their kinds of ways of thinking about the body as a site of inscriptions of violence, but also of resistance, is inspired by the work of the Brazilian Argentine anthropologist Rita Segato, very important work, and that of the Italian social scientist Silvia Federici. So let's just watch again. Well, in this case, the Guardian kind of brings together some images from the putting the body in it, the public performances of the thesis. Yeah? Patriarchy as a judge that judges us for being born. And our punishment is the violence that you don't see. The patriarch is a judge that judges us for being born. And our punishment is the violence that you don't see. It's femicide. Impunity for Michael. Disappearance. Look how massive that is. Right. And it wasn't my fault, not where I was, what I wore. Barcelona. Berlin. London. Paris. in French, of course. You come to Eiffel Tower, Mexico City. Yeah. You're the rapist. The police, the judges of Portland, the state itself, the president. Repressive state is a matter of status. So you would have noticed as well in their performance that many women are wearing either a purple scarf or a green one, which is articulating particular issues within popular feminism, that is in regard to sexual and reproductive rights, as well as the for the case of the purple, and as well as the insistence on having a separation of church and state that is represented by the green. So in pandemic times, las tesis, obviously, having been prominent in the Chilean uprising of October, November 2019, as was noted in that Guardian report, they had to change their tactics. They couldn't do things such as performances in the public because of the stay-at-home orders. But they still managed to do something, and they projected words such as hunger on CBD buildings. Because we can see that the very material reality of women's lives, the lives of their families, their children, their communities, are about pauperization, peripheralization, lack of resources because of the really stratified class system in the country. So the feminism goes beyond just, the way in which sexual violence operates across those scales that I spoke to before, and physical violence, whether it be domestic violence or the violence of military, police, and the state, right? They have that repertoire to be able to imagine body politics in new ways. The experience of hunger, what could be more bodily? And here I want to sort of riff off the work of the Lebanese Canadian poet Trish Salah from her book Wanting in Arabic. There's this little verse: hunger and its competence, that place that you speak from. It could be a literal hunger, not being properly nourished and fed. And you only have to think about what's happening in Gaza right now to understand that that's not just an abstract politics, but it's also a hunger for change, isn't it? I tried to pitch against the body politic. So between the body and embodied politics at a community level, and also the body as a site for the action of politics itself, and political economy, arguably. So in pandemic times, as a result of the lack of provisions of basic items to Chileans and prohibitions about gathering in public space, Las Tesis projected the word hunger on buildings in Santiago, here in that central area, which they renamed Plaza Dignidad, Dignity Plaza. There's actually a public gathering space in the CBD. So thinking body politics, and this is derived from the work of Virginia Vargas. The body as a concept becomes broader, entails multiple positions and spaces of struggles and forms of transgression, including, as we saw in those performances. The body as territory as a concept is contribution from Indigenous women's movements, struggles against extractivism. It insists on a harmony between women's bodies and the cosmos. The racialized body is also found in anti-racist campaigns as advanced by Afro-Brazilian and Latin Caribbean feminists. Questioning the sexual body has also been a site of resignification for sex and gender and the meanings they entail among trans and intersex peoples. For Rita Segato, who I referred to before, the Brazilian-Argentine anthropologist, there is a direct relation between capital and death, between unregulated accumulation and the concentration of wealth and the concomitant sacrifice of poor, brown, and mestizo women, devoured by the cracks in which are articulated the monetary and symbolic economy, the control of the resources and the power of death. Women's bodies are for her a canvas, as I referred to before, on which the marks of a pedagogy of cruelty that's actually inculcated through, the military and the police, and also through certain kinds of patterns of masculinity. But that expresses war, that this is a war on territory and body, on women's bodies and diverse bodies, the war of politics, of armed actors and interests, and of predatory development, which is often securitized by either official military or private contracted military. So going to this question of territorio, cuerpo, y tierra, territory, body, earth, and body territory, this has been used as a political slogan markedly within Maya Cinca, Guatemalan feminism. So especially as we find in the activities, the activism of Lorena Carnal, who's both an ancestral healer and a land defender. So bridging the ongoing struggles of Indigenous women to defend their territories against extractive exploitation with the historical and contemporary violation of Indigenous women's bodies. And unfortunately, there are a lot of cases of that from the Guatemalan state during the so-called civil war. Yeah. Lorena Cabnal contends that cuerpo, tierra, represents an ontological continuum between earth and bodies. It is at once a cosmological and epistemological proposal, and most importantly, a political call by communitarian feminists to defend and recuperate the body as a territory. For her, as a site for healing, right? But also for that process of acuerpamiento, embodied solidarity, linking struggles that she coined as a concept of acuerpamiento. So that's just from the work of Rosa de Ventos Lopez Jaime and Nino Franco. So going more to the words of Lorena Cabnal herself, who I think is probably one of the most significant feminists in Abya Yala. It is since 2003 that around the Association of Women that we formed, Amishmasa, I have to get rid of this thing. From the mountain of Halapan, we imagined and developed our slogan, defense of the body, territory, and territory earth. Analysis of territory leads to two threads. That of cosmogony, of the interpretation of life, and of community feminism. It is a question of defending the territory body in face of different specific violences that we face as women. Sexual violence and feminicides. Since 2004, 2005, the transnational mining industry has grown. The fight became particularly important from 2008, 2009, when the government granted 31 operating licenses to transnationals, triggering a veritable uprising with strong mobilizations of women and other actors. It was then that was born within Abya Yala the historic slogan of recovery and defense of territory earth, a key word for the future community feminism. As women in struggle, we are one with the struggles. In fact, moreover, it is mainly women who put their bodies on the line, on el cuerpo, and are at the front line against police, army, and paramilitary groups deployed to occupy the territory of future mines or dams. So this is actually a translation from the French, because unfortunately, well, it seems that French feminists are able to take on the work of someone like Cabnal as a theorist, but not necessarily yet in the English language. But as you can see, there's a lot there that tells us about the importance of thinking through this optic. And when she talks about the sexual violence that kind of accompanies mining extractivism, that's abundantly clear. There's definitely work that has explored that, including in this country. That is, mining towns, as they arise around mining operations, often involve this kind of risk that women experience because women can only get employment in those temporary towns within domestic labor, within other forms of informal labor, including within sex work. And that creates a kind of economy in which men can, having come from the mines, abuse and exploit women. So the economic aspect is not divorced from the gendered aspect and the realities of body and territory. So feminists, including from Mujeres Creando, speak about the importance not just of decolonization, but also depatriarchalization of land and life. So there are many forms of patriarchal violence, from male partners or ex-partners, that of the state, the police, the courts, within mining and other extractive industries, and the cultures and realities they generate, right? Because very often people who go for work in mines, they come from other areas, and it restructures relations between men and women. But when committed against territory, we're talking about an attack on the means of social reproduction, which is very much, within context of community life, a chief function of women, yeah, and the survival of life itself. There is also that of the armies, paramilitaries, and vested transnational power. All of these are interconnected. For Veronica Gago, also, as mentioned before, this question of indebtedness is important through an extension of neoliberal capitalism known as financialization. Very often we find this kind of exacted through microcredit and loan schemes, which promise to lift women out of poverty and even empower them, right? There are NGOs that are pivoting on these sorts of issues of provision of finance. But this actually can compound the precaritization of women through indebtedness and exact a double burden, that is, of what they do as labor at home and then outside the home within the informal economy, and or also unregulated industries, which permit few rights and protections for them and expose them to contexts of vulnerability. I mean, probably the most emblematic of that is the work that women do in free trade zones, for example, in border areas of different countries. Mexico is a prime example on the northern border with the maquiladoras. Yeah? And Sierra Juarez is a site in which a lot of women have gone missing and been found also dead. And the perpetrators are not accounted for. The state kind of has washed its hands of the issue, but very often because of the co-presence of the military, not the paramilitary, but also crime organizations and so on. The idea that women can be public and can go out to work is a challenge to masculinity, yeah, hegemonic masculinity. And as such, like that economic context of women working within those economies cannot be divorced from the realities that they face, including violence, in this case, disappearance. Hay que politizar las violencias contra las mujeres y los cuerpos feminizados porque las vincula con las violencias de la acumulación capitalista contemporánea, says Veronica Gago. We have to politicize violences against women and feminized bodies because it links them to the violences of contemporary capitalist accumulation. Why would those industries exist if it went for this kind of upward accumulation? These women are paid very meager salaries. And the companies exploit that labor, that feminized labor. Julieta Paredes calls for a deep patriarchalization of land and life, at that point where patriarchy combines with capitalist coloniality. This is an outgrowth of what Paredes calls the patriarchal junction, entronque patriarcal, that binds the inherited characteristics of patriarchy in Latin America. That is to say, patriarchal formations existed pre-conquest, to be sure, but as someone like Rita Segato would say, they were low-intensity patriarchy because they didn't combine all these other features of colonialism and capitalism. Yeah, but the contemporary manifestations build on that. So it's important to think about depatriarchalization and decolonization together. Mujeres Creando is a really good source for thinking communitarian feminisms and autonomous feminisms in Latin America. Of course, there was a lot of discussion about Mujeres Creando in the actual presentation in class. But this idea of the despatriarcalización del cuerpo, ending patriarchal control of the body, has become fundamental in the processes of decolonization for these women in Mujeres Creando. They created the slogan, there is no decolonization without depatriarchalization. Mujeres Creando affirms that the depatriarchalization of the body territory, so they've taken up on this concept as well, and land territory is meaningless without the decolonization of the peoples, pueblos. This slogan has spread, as we've seen. So the metaphor of weaving and reweaving worlds, one that Mujeres Creando also invokes, is used by women in these struggles in Bolivia and outside of Bolivia. Tejer y retejer la vida. Community feminists of Guatemala and Bolivia, peasant feminists, says Claudia Coroy, have contributed lessons of the theoretical and practical radicalism, with a feminism that directly confronts transnational corporations, extractivist policies, and the violence of narco states. Activists such as the already mentioned Berta Cáceres from COPIN, Miriam Miranda from the Black Fraternal Organization of Honduras, OFRENEC, Betty Cariño from the Centro de Apoyo Comunitario Trabajando Juntos, Cactus from Oaxaca, who unfortunately was also murdered. Blanca Chancosa from the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, CONE, Zapatista women in Chiapas, among other significant experiences, have taught popular feminism that are not only about depatriarchalizing within the framework of anti-capitalist struggles, but also about decolonizing our lives. So this really is very proximate to what Mira Jural Davis had theorized as transversal politics, right? Community, popular, territorial feminisms, not neoliberal or liberal, not NGOized, are not concerned with particular individual rights, women's rights, understood that way. They provide an alternative to the sort of universalistic and assimilationist politics of the left on the one hand, and the identity politics that does sometimes incur on the other. So it's not about woman as a stable unitary subject either. Yeah. The first has proved to be ethnocentric and exclusionary. The second has proved to be essentialist, rareifying boundaries or differences between different women. This implies cross-difference solidarities, acuerpamiento, and alliances that do not negate difference. So coming together, but also maintaining distance, not dominating. Yeah. People who identify themselves as belonging to the same collectivity or category can be positioned very differently in relation to a whole range of social classifications: class, gender, ability, sexuality, stage in the life cycle even. These feminisms acknowledge that, transversal feminisms do, but also look for the ground for intersections within locations, not just identity. Yeah. So the experience of violence in different locations, context of violence, for example, as experienced in precarious work situations, are also a place for that. The body and body politics then becomes a place in which these forces can be inscribed, but also contested. So one of the readings for today, suggested readings, not required readings, was When the Body Speaks the Political, or When the Body Speaks to the Political, Feminist Activism by Natalia de Sousa. The place of the body, she proposes, actual material situated bodies, laboring, suffering, are sites of an enunciated politics, speaking from the body, speaking through to the body and to the body. The language of the conquest and also colonial reinscriptions of violence of on bodies is important here, especially given the alarming rise in femicides. And it has allowed activists to ignite new alliances, as we can see in the work of Nitna Menos. The recent trajectory of protests shows achievements of mobilizations of the women's movement in Abya Yala, and the body and materiality are at the forefront, particularly in regard to the killing of women and the question of bodies, racialized and class bodies, young women, including those who fall victim to the hands of the authorities, who are supposed to impart social services and care, and the complicity in not actually investigating their murders. Women's deaths are posited as a mode of necropolitics, the ultimate functioning of the political and economic order of the contemporary scene. How this social order is bodied forth, a critique and engagement with women's energies, not just value, is part of the alternative vision of social reproduction that this form of feminism proposes. And the place of mothers is central to this, which is why we started off with the motif of mothers, as is the work of women, including that's not recognized. So I'm referred to Nitna Menos as a movement that really articulates these interconnected sites. Yeah. We have mentioned them in class before, so I won't spend too much time. They were involved in a women's strike, and in the tutorial, which we'll move to shortly, we'll look at some statements from that strike and how it enunciated this enunciative politics and what positions were propounded therein. I'll leave us with this particular statement because we don't have time to go much further. Vivas y libres nos queremos. We are the housewives, the workers of the formal and informal economy, the teachers, the cooperatives, the academics, the workers, the unemployed, the journalists, the militants, the artists, the mothers, the daughters, the domestic employees, those you cross by in the streets, those that leave the house, those that are in the neighborhood, those that went to a party, those that have a meeting, those who walk alone or accompanied, those who decide to abort, those who do not, those who decide on how and with whom to live our sexuality. We are women, trans, travesti, lesbians. We are many, and from the fear that they want to impose on us and the fury from the way in which they take us by force of violence, we make a sound, a mobilization, a common cry, not one less. We want us alive. So that's a powerful note to end on. Let's go along to the tutorial and hopefully we'll have people join us.